Who was a three-term senator in the 2000 election. I won by 2,229 votes. And I'm forever grateful to Senator Gorton for having faith in that election that included provisional ballots and signatures and all sorts of things that people really understood. I think that's the principle here. Our election in the state of Washington is based on your signature. That's the way it is now when you vote in person, and it is the way it is when you vote by mail. So our system has a lot of security in it, and this legislation that's before us today is to make sure that these rights, these civil liberties, and constitutional rights of individuals are upheld throughout the United States of America. Now, I understand some of my colleagues may not like the ethics reform or campaign finance reform in the underlying bill. I support them. But at the heart of this debate is whether we're going to fight to make sure that the federal government does its job on constitutional rights. I feel like there's a little bit of hiding going on in this discussion about whether we have a role, that this is somehow left up to the states, which reminds me when Rosa Parks was sitting on a bus, we didn't say it's just up to those individual states, or when people were denied equal accommodations at hotels, we didn't say it was just up to those states, and we certainly didn't say when people used police dogs trying to intimidate women to vote in the 1960s that it was just up to those states. No, we did something about it. We passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We did that because intimidation was happening, and we needed to correct for it. So I hope that our colleagues will think about this issue, because to me it's the same debate we're having on criminal justice reform. So many people on the other side of the aisle said, you know what, this is up to local police departments, and it's just up to the local governments, and that's all there is to it. No, that is not all there is to this. This is about whether we do our job in upholding these constitutional rights when certain states don't do that. And so these American voting rights are guaranteed by our Constitution. The 15th Amendment provides that voting rights cannot be abridged on the count of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment, which turned 100 years old last year, provides the voting rights cannot be denied on account of sex. The 26th Amendment provides that Americans 18 years of age or older cannot be denied the right to vote on account of age. Generations of Americans fought for these rights over many decades, and they didn't come easy to us as a nation. And nor should we overlook now these issues as we think that these rights, these constitutional obligations that we should be fighting for and should uphold, are facing challenges at the local level. I know that my colleagues say that these are state rights to hold these elections. In fact, Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution empowers Congress to make or alter rules for federal elections. The U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld this authority as broad and comprehensive. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that the Election Clause of the Constitution gives Congress the authority to, quote, override state laws to regulate federal elections. Now, this was in a pretty famous case in 2015, the majority opinion in the Arizona State Legislature versus the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. Justice Ginsburg wrote, quote, the dominant purpose of the Elections Clause, the historical record bears out, was to empower Congress to override state election rules. The clause was also intended to act as a safeguard against manipulation of electoral rules by politicians and factions in the states to entrench themselves or place their interests over those of the electorate, end quote. So these issues are very clear. It is calling on us to make sure that we uphold those constitutional rights. But according to the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law, at least 14 states, from Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, and many others, have enacted voting rights since the 2020 election to restrict individuals. My colleagues have been out here talking about some of those restrictions. And I think those that are place undue burdens on individuals are something that we should be addressing. Yes, states have been at a different pace in allowing vote by mail or identification as it relates to the vote by mail system, but we should be empowering people. We should say that we want to empower more people to vote under a system that is fair and gives them those opportunities to do so. So there are at least 64 bills restricting voting rights moving through 18 state legislatures, and I think that we should making sure here that we have clarity on what will help us continue to empower the public to cast their vote. This comprehensive bill also authorizes $1.7 billion in new federal grants to help secure the security of our voting system. Again, I like our vote-by-mail system in Washington State. It's based on my signature to the ballot that is checked at the ballot. I can tell you in the last election, because of the ruses and various things that went on, I think 13 different people said that they voted for me, but they didn't, and the election system caught that. They knew that
Bragg, one of the largest military installations in the world, entirely within the Eastern District. Currently, the district lines bisect the base, resulting in unnecessary administrative and logistical problems for the people of our state. The legislation will ease the burdens of traveling miles to Durham, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and instead let service members resolve matters in nearby Fayetteville or Raleigh. A similar redistricting occurred several years ago when Congress moved Butner into the Eastern District. This bipartisan piece of legislation will benefit our service members and their families. I'm honored to work with my North Carolina colleagues, Congressman Hudson, Senators Tillis and Burr, my colleague from my law school class, and the entire delegation to get this bill across the finish line. I'm pleased it passed out of the Senate and look forward to passing it in the House and having it signed into law by the President. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have no further speakers.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a sensible improvement to the administration of justice in my home state. I urge my colleagues to support the bill and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is a good day on the floor of the House. S. 1340 will improve the administration of justice in the federal courts in North Carolina. This is not only a bipartisan, bicameral effort, but it is also evidence of Republicans and Democrats working together for the uplifting of justice. I appreciate the leadership of Representative Ross in bringing this bill forward, and I hope all my colleagues will enthusiastically support this bill. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. All remaining time has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 1340? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, for what purpose does the gentleman from Montana seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would request the yeas and nays, please.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2679, the foundation of the Federal Bar Association Charter Amendments Act of 2021 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
HR 2679, a bill to amend Title 36 United States Code to revise the federal charter for the foundation of the Federal Bar Association.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 2679.
Without objection,
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
the gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2679, the foundation of the Federal Bar Association Charter Amendments Act of 2021, makes important changes to the federal charter for the foundation of the Federal Bar Association. This legislation intended to give the Federal Bar Association the flexibility it needs to operate well into the future without the need for further congressional amendment. Among other things, the legislation makes the following changes to the association's charter. It requires the Board of Directors to decide and specify in the bylaws the location of the principal office. It specifies that the bylaws, not the charter, must provide for the terms of membership.
Mr. President.
The senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, when I look at this substitute, I'm reminded of the adage, the new boss is the same as the old boss. In this case, the new bill is the same as the old bill. It's got a different number, but it still maintains the same flawed policies that S1 maintained. Now, obviously, the majority would like to pass this bill, or they wouldn't have labeled it their most important piece of legislation for this Congress. The House of Representatives labeled the same bill, HR1, their most important piece of legislation for this Congress. The changes basically give election officials more time to implement policies that I don't think we need, and I think the changes don't make the bill less bad. In fact, what the bill does is it creates a new boss for elections, but the new boss is the federal government. It's not about voting rights. It doesn't add any group or any individuals to the group of people who can vote, the kind of things that Congress has done in the past, starting in the first century of the country and moving on till today. It's frankly a politically motivated federal takeover of the election systems that would make, in my opinion, elections more chaotic, less secure, less nimble in their ability to deal with individual circumstances that occur on election day. The strength of the election system, Mr. President, is the diversity of the election system. This is what President Obama thought in 2016. He may not still believe that, but I still believe it. S1 would force a single partisan view of elections on more than 10,000 voting jurisdictions across the country, taking control away from states, taking control away from local officials, and frankly, they're the closest people to the voters, and instead giving it people in a faraway national capital without the same sense of importance of people believing that what happened on election day at your precinct is what the voters intended to have happen that day, and that the people who were voting were the people who were legally able to vote, not people who may have voted somewhere else, not people who may no longer live in the jurisdiction that they're voting in and no longer qualified to vote for that county official or that state representative or whoever, but people who are legally able to vote. I think this makes fraud easier to commit and frankly harder to detect. What we should be doing is making it easier to vote and harder to cheat. I think what we're doing here is making it easier to cheat and harder to find out. We allow, in this bill, if it was the law, unlimited ballot harvesting. This is where anybody can go around and collect ballots and theoretically be sure that they get to the election authority, but who knows? Who knows what ballot got lost in the mail and what ballot never got in the mail? You know, one of the things the ballot harvester would develop a pretty good sense of is how the person voted whose ballot they were harvesting. This bill undermines popular voter ID laws that more than half of the states have implemented, makes it more difficult to maintain accurate voter lists. It permanently tips the scales in favor of our friends on the other side by politicizing the Federal Election Commission, a commission that was established just like our Ethics Commission, Mr. President, in the Senate, with an equal number of one party and no imbalance. This politicizes the Federal Election Commission. It makes it a partisan agency, not a bipartisan policing agency. It pours federal funds into campaigns, and it chills free speech. It's bad policy, I think, Mr. President, in search of a problem. Now, Democrats have said this is necessary to increase voting rights, particularly for minorities, but the overall turnout in the year 2000 was about 2/3 of all the voters, the highest percentage of voters that participated in over a century. So what we have here is an election that had the highest level of participation in over a century. Most states had their highest voter turnout in 40 years, and we decide we need to change the system. S1 isn't just about bad policy, it's about what Democrats have seen as a political imperative. Now, frankly, this has been the bill that Democrats have offered for about the last 20 years. It varies a little bit from time to time, but about 20 years ago, and maybe before that, I was a chief election official in our state at that time. I don't remember Democrats offering this before 20 years ago, but starting about 2 decades ago, every couple of years, and certainly every time Democrats get a majority in the House, they pass this bill or one almost exactly like it. When asked about what it would take to maintain the current majority in the House, Speaker Pelosi said, well, we'd be better if we could pass HR1 and S1. That sounds like she thinks there is a political advantage there, and I respect the Speaker's political judgment and always have respected Speaker Pelosi's political judgment. Her judgment would be that this would be better for Democrats than not changing the current election law. S1 is really full of unnecessary, and as it turns out, unpopular provisions. You know, under the label, would you like to vote for a bill that would secure democracy? Well, of course, who wouldn't want to be for securing democracy? Fortunately, this bill has been around long enough that people have begun to understand what's in it. Same list that's been out there before. This bill would render state voter ID laws meaningless by requiring states to allow affidavits in lieu of identification. In other words, you say who you are at the polling place. Well, anybody who's going to try to cast a ballot at the polling place they shouldn't cast, probably also likely to be willing to say that they're qualified to vote at that election. In a recent poll, a poll that came out this week, 80% of Americans supported voter ID laws. Another poll just a couple of weeks ago, national support for photo ID was 75%. That included 69% of black voters and 60% of Democrats. So we've got a principled position of this bill that 80% of all voters, at least 75% of all voters, and 60% of Democrats are for, but this bill changes that law that makes sense to almost everybody. This bill requires that unlimited ballot harvesting that I talked about just a minute ago. Now, Mr. President, the only time I recall a congressional discussion recently about ballot harvesting was last year when the House of Representatives refused to seat a Republican elected member because that campaign had used ballot harvesting. Now we have a law that requires every state not to prohibit ballot harvesting, and the risk of fraud, the risk of every ballot not getting to the place ballots need to be certainly increases when you hand them to A ballot harvester, usually somebody paid by a campaign or a party to go around and collect ballots, and someone whose motivation to get those ballots all turned in may not be everything you'd want it to be. 62% of respondents in one poll said ballot harvesting should be illegal. Another provision in this bill that clearly is not a popular provision if people begin to look at it. Now again, voting to protect democracy, sure, that's popular, but the way this bill does it, when people look at it, it's not popular. The bill requires states to give felons the right to vote in federal elections when they're out of prison. Some states do that, some states don't. Of course, if this bill passed, every state would have the choice of going ahead and doing that or having two sets of voter rolls, one for federal elections and another one for non-federal elections. That, of course, makes no sense at all, and what this bill anticipates is that no matter what states wanted to do, this is provision that they'd have to adopt. There's another way to get that done. Go to state legislatures and explain the value of having that change if that change needs to be made. This bill restricts the ability of states to maintain accurate voter rolls. Many states with Democrat governors and Democrat secretaries of state and Democrat legislatures have worked hard to see that they had a system in place to where you would periodically check and see if the people who are registered to vote are still where they registered to vote from. You know, our state, I think a lot of states, if you move to another county and register to vote there, you're supposed to say as part of that process who you could notify to get you off the voter rolls, but there's no requirement that that has to happen. And a periodic check of the voter rolls was seen not too long ago as a huge protection of democracy. This makes it much harder to do, but a 2018 poll found that 77% of Americans supported this kind of voter roll maintenance. Frankly, it'd be pretty hard to come up with a bill that had so many major tenets that were so out of step with what people think the government ought to do and what they want their state government to do, and in most cases where state governments are doing this. This bill provides government funding for campaigns, $6 of federal money for every dollar raised in small donors. Now, small donors is under $200. Frankly, if you were doing this, Mr. President, there'd be the current members of the Senate under this bill could receive up to collectively $1.8 billion from the federal government to run their campaigns, to attack their challenger or whatever they want to do with their campaign money. $1.8 billion to do that. Pretty easy to qualify for this money. We saw people raise money in the first quarter of this year that would have qualified, in the case of our friend, the senator from Texas, Senator Cruz, somewhere between $25 and $30 million would go to his campaign. Now, we had a markup on this bill in the Rules Committee. Not a single member of the Rules Committee, Democrat or Republican, including Senator Cruz, thought Senator Cruz should get $24 or $25 million from the federal government for his campaign. The bill creates a partisan Federal Elections Commission. It gets rid of that bipartisan makeup that's been there from the very start. This bill chills free speech in that it creates a disclosure document that makes it really people reluctant to give money to other groups that aren't candidates who'd like to talk about elections, and it federalizes redistricting. S1 would put in place one set of federal rules for redrawing congressional districts that have always been the role of the states. If a state wants to give that out to somebody besides the legislature, they can do that, and many states have done that. But states have been the constitutional designated place to determine how they draw congressional maps in their own state. And even if a state manages to comply with all these requirements, under this bill, the Justice Department would have to be involved. Under this bill, the court of jurisdiction in all cases on redistricting would be the federal court in Washington, D.C., not the federal court in the circuit that Missouri's in, you wouldn't even start at the district court in Kansas City or St. Louis. The federal court in Washington, D.C. would be the place you'd go. But of course, the purpose of the bill is to bring all these election decisions to one place. The idea that the best decisions are always made in Washington, D.C. on all topics is an idea that most Americans don't agree with. There are things they think we can do and should do and can only do because they can't do them any other way, like defend the country and set big national priorities. But for well over 200 years now, local election officials responsible for the sense of credibility of what happens on election day have done this job. I think they've done it well. This bill would require states to take burdensome actions and make expensive changes in their election system. Even if the states have already adopted some of the so-called reforms, they in all likelihood have to make changes in their system to comply. So the federal takeover elections shouldn't happen. I urge my colleagues not to support it happening. The American people don't want to see the things imposed on our election system that are in this bill, and I urge my colleagues to vote against this harmful legislation. And I would yield back.
Madam President.
The Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, every day that I have the honor of coming to work in the hallowed halls of this building, a symbol to the country and to the world of America's commitment to liberty and to justice, freedom and democracy, I'm humbled. I'm humbled by the faith and responsibility that the people of Oregon have placed in me to advocate on their behalf. I'm humbled by the responsibility to exercise the power of this office, to use the opportunity to lift up all Americans, to create a foundation for families to thrive, to tackle significant challenges like human rights and global warming. But among all these responsibilities, one is the highest, which is to defend our constitutional republic. And in that Constitution, the single most important power given to every American is the right to a voice and a vote in the decisions of this government and the direction of our nation. As we saw all too clearly on January 6th, when this very building was attacked by a mob intent on burning the ballots of millions of Americans, democracy based on free and fair elections is far from guaranteed. Each generation, each new set of senators and House members has the responsibility to defend it anew. The sad truth, however, is that a violent mob storming the Capitol isn't the only way to attack our democracy. It can also be attacked by the quiet plotting of powerful and privileged individuals who hate the concept of government of, by, and for the people. And they work to undermine and corrupt the workings of our republic to produce instead government by and for the powerful. In his inaugural address, our second president, John Adams, remarked that we should be unfaithful to ourselves if we should ever lose sight of the danger to our liberties, if anything partial or extraneous should infect the purity of our free, fair, virtuous, and independent elections. Well, my friends, our democracy, our elections are being infected. Our elections are under siege from gerrymandering, which destroys the principle of equal representation. Our system is under siege from dark money, enabling billionaires and powerful corporations to buy our elections. It is under siege by state laws being passed week to week right now that target specific communities to prevent them from voting, thereby manipulating the outcome of elections. Indeed, in at least 22 laws have been enacted in 14 states since January to infect our free and fair elections, to deliberately erect barriers meant to make it harder for targeted groups of Americans to vote, to silence their voices of students and low-income Americans, of Native Americans and seniors, of Black and brown Americans, who have fought too long and too hard to have their voice and their vote stolen from them, ripped from them now. We have a responsibility as United States Senators to ensure every American's freedom to vote, just as this institution sought to do more than half a century ago, when in this chamber we passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We have a responsibility to ensure that every American's voice is heard and that our elections reflect the will of the people. We can fulfill that responsibility by enacting national standards for voting to ensure that every American can have a say in the key decisions impacting their daily lives, a say expressed through the ballot box. That ballot box is the beating heart of our republic, and those who seek to erect barriers to citizens having access to it are committing a crime against our democracy. We have to stop that criminal action against the rights of Americans. We must create those national standards by taking up this bill, the For the People bill, debating it, and ultimately passing it to defend our Constitution. The For the People Act is comprehensive. It does popular, common sense things to put the American people back in charge of their government and their country. It sets national standards so every American has equal freedom to vote no matter where they live. In this country, if you are an American, you have the right to vote, plain and simple, full stop. It doesn't matter what your zip code is, or your income, or the color of your skin, or your religious beliefs. You have the right to vote. Many of the state laws restricting voting are designed to eliminate early voting in person or by mail, and we know exactly why. It is because the leaders in these states know how easy it is to manipulate the vote on Election Day. In these targeted communities, the state's leaders want to be able to decrease the number of polling places, reduce the hours, change the locations, put polling places in locations with limited parking, put out false information about the date of the election, and purge targeted voters from the roll of registered voters, knowing that when they show up on Election Day, it's too late to correct the error and be able to exercise their right to vote. The antidote to these horrendous, racist attacks on the freedom and right of every American to vote is early voting in person and by mail. And this act guarantees 15 days of early voting. It sets forth the opportunity to acquire an absentee ballot, to return the ballot by mail or through dedicated drop boxes. The second big goal in national standards set forth in For the People Act is to stop billionaires from buying elections. Elections in America are intended to reflect the will of the people, not the will of the powerful and privileged. Thomas Jefferson once described this as the mother principle, saying that governments are Republican only in proportion to how they embody the will of the people. If the mega wealthy can flood our campaigns with billions of dollars sent through shell companies, untraceable money, and manipulate the outcome of the elections, then Jefferson's mother principle is murdered, because the outcome serves the powerful, not the people. The For the People Act says that people should have an equal chance of being heard, and that the people listening ought to know who's actually behind those voices and those messages. It does that by creating an honest ads policy. So political ads people see online have to disclose who's paying for them. And it does that by requiring the disclosure of mega donors contributing to political campaigns. Now, if you or I give a modest donation to a campaign, that campaign has to disclose who we are. Shouldn't the same thing that's true for an average American be true for the mega donors? This standard sets that equal standard. Third, the national standards set forth in this bill restore equal representation by ending gerrymandering, the process by which we draw congressional districts to favor one party over another, and by doing so, attack the sacred principle of equal representation. This creates a lot of bias in the House of Representatives down the hall. Take Michigan. In 2012, 14, and 16, the majority of Michiganders voted for one party at every level of government, but because of gerrymandering, the other party held a decisive advantage in the State House, in the State Senate, and in the Congressional House delegation. The For the People Act defends, restores the principle of equal representation. It does it by creating independent redistricting commissions, made up equally of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. That means candidates running for office actually have to use the power of their ideas, the persuasion of their personality, not a rigged system to hold power. Finally, the standards in this bill target corruption by addressing and eliminating conflicts of interest. Public servants should serve the public, not themselves. That includes members of Congress, the administration, and for the first time ever, the Supreme Court. This bill does that by striking down outrageous and corrupt conflicts of interest, strengthening divestment requirements, saying the president and vice president have to use a blind trust or limit their personal holdings to assets that don't pose a potential conflict of interest. It slows the revolving door between public service and K Street. It requires cabinet secretaries to recuse themselves from any issues in which a previous employer or client has a financial interest. The bill requires candidates for vice president or president to disclose their tax returns to prevent hidden conflicts of interest. Creates a code of ethics for the Supreme Court, something all other federal judges already have. None of these four principles is about helping one political party over the other. In fact, the provisions I've just laid out are wildly popular among the American people. An overwhelming supermajority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents support these four principles. It's as bipartisan as you can get. Even when it's broken into its specific provisions, 3 out of 4 Americans, Democrats, Republicans, independents, say they support these reforms because they believe in the vision of government of, by, and for the people. It's in our DNA. Americans believe that dark money should not be able to flood our elections. They believe billionaires and corporations should not be able to buy elections. They believe our nation is ill-served by corrupt conflicts of interest. They believe in the vision and ideals of our We the People Republic. And this bill is meant to do just one thing: make real the promise of democracy for all Americans. But powerful special interests don't want that. It threatens their hold on power by ending the ways they've rigged the system. And so they're all about striking down this bill. Why is that? We hear how Republican leaders say that they like this rigged system. Apparently, they like dark money in campaigns helping to buy elections. Apparently, they like targeting groups of individuals to prevent them from voting, taking us back to the racist efforts that existed before 1965 Voting Rights Act. Apparently, they like gerrymandering, thinking it's a source of political power down the hall, which political scientists say it is. But should it be principle or power that we fight for here? It should be the principle and the oath of office we took to uphold the Constitution. Standing before a crowd on a November afternoon to dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg, 4 months after that momentous battle, President Lincoln remarked that they were gathered together to not only dedicate it to the men who had fallen in battle, but to the ideal for which they gave their lives, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Today, it is our responsibility to carry that ideal forward and to ensure that government by the people, of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the United States of America. We in this chamber must pass the For the People Act. Thank you. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
Without objection.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I come to the floor to speak in support of proceeding to debate legislation that is critical to our democracy. Legislation that is based on two simple ideas: that Americans must be able to freely choose their elected officials, and that government must be accountable to the people, not to those with the most money. These are not Democratic or Republican ideas. They are core American ideas. But for too long, these rights have been under attack, which is why we need the critical democracy reforms in the For the People Act. I'm honored to be leading this legislation with Senators Merkley and Schumer, and to have worked with my colleagues as chair of the Rules Committee, work with my colleagues in the House and civil rights and democracy reform groups, and you, Madam President, to bring this bill forward today. The freedom to vote is fundamental to all of our freedoms. It is how Americans control their government and hold elected officials accountable. It is the bedrock of our government. It is the founding principle of our country and has stood the test of wars, of economic strife, and yes, a global pandemic. But protecting this right has not always been easy. Throughout our country's 245-year history, we've had to course correct and take action to ensure that democracy is for the people and by the people, and that it has lived up to our ideals. At the beginning of this year, we were reminded on January 6th that it is up to us to protect against threats to our democracy, to ensure that it succeeds. I still remember that moment, 3:30 in the morning, when Senator Blunt and I, and yes, Vice President Pence, walked from this chamber with the two young women with the mahogany box full of the last ballots to get over to the House to finish our jobs, so that you, Madam President, were declared the Vice President and President Biden was declared the President. That's upholding our democracy. That's doing it together, Democrats and Republicans doing our job. And what this bill is about, to me, this bill is about carrying on that torch to protect our democracy. Today, the vote to begin debate on this legislation will likely get the support of all 50 Democrats. Senator Manchin, along with the rest of our caucus, has made clear to the country that standing up for the right to vote is bigger than any one person or thing. It's about us. It's about us as Americans. I deeply appreciate the work he has put into the proposal he's putting forward today, and I look forward to continuing our discussions with him. He is doing this in good faith. There are many good things in that proposal, and today we are here together to reaffirm we will not give up this fight. It is just beginning. The 2020 election showed that you can make it safer to vote while giving voters the options that work for them. If it's vote by mail, I see my colleague Senator Smith here. Minnesota is so proud of our same-day registration. That's worked for us. It's made us #1 in voter turnout in the country time and time and time again. Many states during the pandemic took steps exactly like that, extending options for voters like safe vote by mail. And now 34 states have no excuse, vote by mail. 34 states. The result? More than nearly 160 million Americans voted, more than ever before, and in the middle of a pandemic. I still remember those voters in the primary in Wisconsin standing in makeshift garbage bags with makeshift masks over their face in the middle of a rainstorm, in the middle of a pandemic, standing in line to vote. And in an election that the Trump Department of Homeland Security declared the most secure in our history, the American people elected, yes, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. But in the wake of that historic election, there has been a pervasive, coordinated, and overwhelming effort to undermine the freedom to vote in future elections, with over 400 bills introduced in legislators across the country. 22 laws to restrict voting have been enacted in 14 states, and 31 more bills to roll back the right to vote have passed at least one chamber of a state legislature. As Reverend Warnock put it in this chamber in his maiden speech as senator, some people don't want some people to vote. That is what's going on here. The new law in Georgia makes it harder to request mail-in ballots, drastically limits ballot drop boxes, and makes it a crime to hand water and food to voters waiting in line to cast their ballots, when in previous elections, Georgians have stood in line for up to 10 hours to vote. One of the new Montana laws ended same-day registration on Election Day after it had been in practice in the state for 15 years, with Senator Tester joining me in trying to bring this practice across when we introduced that bill across this nation. In the weeks ahead, similar bills are expected to pass in even more states, including Texas, where the governor has promised to call the legislature into special session to pass a bill to restrict voting that was blocked at the end of regular session, thanks to the heroic efforts of Democrats in the Texas state legislature that blessed us with their presence just last week. These are not empty threats. They are real efforts to disenfranchise regular Americans from voting, senior citizens, people with disabilities, people that can't stand in line for 10 hours just to wait to vote. In the face of these efforts to roll back voting rights in so many states, the For the People Act is about setting basic national standards to make sure that all voters in this country can vote legally in the way that works for them, regardless of what zip code they live in, regardless of if they live in a big city or in a suburb or out in a small town in western Minnesota. It is about reducing the power of big money in our elections by ending secret spending by billionaires and special interests. And it is about making anti-corruption reforms to ensure politicians work for the people, not for themselves. Republicans have said that this bill is designed to provide a political advantage. But as former Republican commissioner of the Federal Election Commissioner, that chair under George Bush, Trevor Potter, has said in explaining his support for this bill, and he appeared as a witness in my hearing for this bill, he said, this bill does not give power to any particular party over another. It gives power back to the voters. And giving power back to the voters is exactly what we need. There is an amplified attack on the right to vote this year, but we've seen serious efforts to restrict voting rights since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act 8 years ago. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 that marked the cornerstone achievement for the civil rights movement and became the law because of the tireless work of people like John Lewis, who put their lives on the line to secure voting rights. 56 years later, we are still fighting that battle. At the same time, we haven't had meaningful campaign finance or ethics reform. Our democracy desperately needs the proposals in this bill. And guess what? The American people agree. Yeah, this bill is bipartisan, except right here in this place. It's bipartisan because one poll released recently found that 78% of Americans, including 63% of Republicans, support making early in-person voting available for at least 2 weeks before Election Day. That's a proposal in our original For the People. It is in the manager's amendment that we're voting on cloture on, and it is in Senator Manchin's proposal. Another poll found that 83% of likely voters support public disclosure of contributions to groups involved in elections. Also, the Disclose Act in all three proposals. And yet some of my Republican colleagues want to limit disclosures. By the way, disclosures were championed by Justice Scalia. And yet, what happened in our committee hearing on this, our markup? Republicans filed amendment after amendment to gut those provisions of the bill. So while they may claim, my friends on the other side of the aisle, that this isn't popular, it is just not true. They claim it's not bipartisan. It is just not true. The bill contains 9 bipartisan bills, including the Honest Ads Act, which I first introduced with Senator John McCain and Senator Warner. And now Senator Lindsey Graham took up that cause. Our provision, that provision would finally hold the social media companies accountable to make sure that there are disclaimer and disclosures on political ads. The work that I've done with Senator Langford, with you, Madam President, when you were in the Senate, to make sure we have backup paper ballots. We still have 8 states that don't have backup paper ballots. That provision is in this bill. Many of the bill's provisions have already been adopted in red, blue, and purple states and have the support of governors and election officials from both parties. 21 states have same-day voter registration, including red states like Idaho, Wyoming, and Iowa. That's great, but our question should be, why don't all 50 states have it, especially when the Constitution of the United States specifically says that Congress can make and alter rules for federal elections. It is as clear as the words on the page. 20 states have automatic voter registration laws, including Alaska, Georgia, and West Virginia. 45 states allowed all voters to vote by mail in the 2020 election, and 44 states have early voting. What this bill does is to take the best of the best and puts in place minimum standards so that no matter what state you call home, you have access to the ballot box. That is why Senator Merkley has worked so hard on this legislation. That is why Senator Schumer made this bill Senate File Number 1. The bill that we are voting to advance includes changes that directly respond to concerns about implementation from both Democratic and Republican state and local officials. We heard those concerns, and the Democrats on the Rules Committee, which included Senator Warner and Senator King, we worked on that manager's amendment and made it easier for rural areas, extended the time systems, and got at their concerns. And then Senator Manchin has come up with more ideas and more things that we can do to make the bill strong. We heard from election officials that requiring states to accept mail-in ballots for too long after Election Day would delay them from certifying the results. So we shortened the window. I could go on and on and on. In good faith, we have worked to make this bill work for America. And now it is time to allow for debate on this bill. Our Republican friends on the other side of the aisle, they say this bill, this was one thing that Senator McConnell would say in the hearing, that it would cause chaos. I'd say this, chaos is a 5-hour wait to vote. Senior citizens standing in the hot sun for 5 hours, for 10 hours, that is chaos. Chaos is purging eligible voters from voter rolls and modern-day poll taxes and one ballot box for a county of 5 million people, which is exactly what they did in Harris County, Texas. That is exactly what is happening in that state right now. Chaos is voters in Wisconsin waiting in line to vote for hours in the rain in their homemade masks and plastic garbage bags. The angry mob on January 6th that came into this very chamber, that spray painted the columns, that attacked police officers, that injured people left and right, that is chaos. As I said from the stage on Inauguration Day, under that bright blue sky, where you could still see the spray paint at the bottom of those columns and the makeshift windows we had in place, I said this is the day our democracy picks itself up, brushes off the dust, and does what America always does, goes forward as a nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, we cannot do that if Americans are disenfranchised, if they are not part of our democracy. Republicans have sadly made it clear that this is not legislation they are willing to negotiate or even debate. They won't even give it a week. They won't even give it a few days. Just last week, they held a press conference to tell the American people that they don't believe Congress should act to protect the right to vote or get rid of secret money in our elections. So, honestly, I would love to get some support from the other side of the aisle, but we have to be honest. I don't expect we're going to get it. So my Republican colleagues, this is not the end of the line for this bill. This is not the end of the line. This is only the beginning. Because if you have your way, those voters won't just be at the end of the line. They're not going to be able to vote. In the Rules Committee, we will be holding a series of hearings, not just one hearing, a series of hearings, and we are taking it on the road for the first time in a long time. We are going to Georgia and holding a field hearing there so we can hear firsthand from people in the state on what is happening and why we must carry out the constitutional duty in this chamber to act. And I urge my Republican colleagues to recognize the work being done in states to restrict the freedom of Americans to exercise their sacred right to vote. Our nation was founded on the ideals of democracy, and we've seen for ourselves in this building how we can never take it for granted. We can't let state legislators get to pick and choose who votes and what votes get counted. That's not how a democracy works. I urge all of my colleagues to do what the American people are asking us to do and to do what is right. Vote today to bring us closer to passing legislation to strengthen our democracy. We can't wait in line, and we can't make the people of America wait in line. The time to do this is now. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
And first, let me thank so many of my colleagues, including our Chair of Rules, the Senator from Minnesota, our lead sponsor on this bill, Senator Merkley, and so many others who have done so much on this legislation. Now, what makes a democracy a democracy? It's the right of citizens to choose their own leader, to forge their own destiny, rather than have it decided for them. The right to vote. The right that generations of Americans have marched and protested to achieve. Women who reached for the ballot and marchers who were bloodied on a bridge in Selma. The right that generations of American soldiers fought and died to defend, buried now in patriot graves from Normandy to Gettysburg. And right now, it is a fact, that voting rights are under assault in America in a way that we have not seen in many, many decades. Republican state legislators are limiting polling hours, locations, and ballot drop boxes, raising new ID barriers for students, making it a crime to give food and water to voters in line, and in states like Texas, trying to move Sunday voting hours so it's harder for black churchgoers to go to the polls after services. It's the most sweeping voter suppression effort in at least 80 years, targeting all the ways that historically disenfranchised voters, black and brown Americans, students, the working poor, access the ballot. We can disagree about solutions to this problem, about which policies might be more effective, but we should all agree this is a problem. We should all agree that protecting voting rights is worthy of debate. And that's what this next vote is about. Should the United States Senate even debate how to protect the voting rights of our citizens? The story of American democracy is full of contradictions and halting progress. At the time of our Constitution's ratification, you had to be in most states a white, male, Protestant landowner to vote. How many in this chamber, how many of us would have been able to participate in those first elections? The truth is, many of us, particularly on our side of the aisle, would not have been able to vote. But ever since the early days of the Republic, Americans launched mighty movements, fought a bloody civil war, and yes, passed federal election laws to expand the franchise until there were no more boundaries. Are we going to backslide here in the 21st century? Are we going to let reactionary state legislatures drag us back into the muck of voter suppression? Are we going to let the most dishonest president in history continue to poison our democracy from the inside? Or will we stand up to defend what generations of Americans have organized, marched, fought, and died for, the sacred, sacred right to vote? The thing that makes a democracy a democracy. I plead with my Republican colleagues. Stand up, my Republican colleagues. Stand up to a man who has lied. We all know he has lied. You know he has lied about our elections. Do not let this man lead you around by the nose and do permanent damage to our democracy. At least have the decency and honor to let this chamber debate. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. And ask I yield the floor.
Okay. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 77 as 2093, a bill to expand Americans' access to the ballot box, reduce the influence of big money in politics, strengthen ethics rules for public servants, and implement other anti-corruption measures for the purpose of fortifying our democracy and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed on S2093, a bill to expand Americans' access to the ballot box, reduce the influence of big money in politics, strengthen ethics rules for public servants, and implement other anti-corruption measures for the purpose of fortifying our democracy and for other purposes shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Markley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Booker, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Schatz, Schumer, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Burr, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Grassley, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Marshall, McConnell, Paul, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of South Carolina, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Ms. Lummis. No. Ms. Collins. No. Mr. Young. No. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Graham, no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. No. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan. No. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe. No.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
Madam President.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Madam President, I want to be clear about what just happened on the Senate floor. Every single Senate Republican just voted against starting debate on legislation to protect Americans' voting rights. Once again, the Senate Republican minority has launched a partisan blockade of a pressing issue here in the United States Senate, an issue no less fundamental than the right to vote. Could we have order, Madam President?
The Senate will be in order.
I've laid out the facts for weeks. Republican state legislatures across the country are engaged in the most sweeping voter suppression in 80 years, capitalizing on and catalyzed by Donald Trump's big lie. These state governments are making it harder for younger, poorer, urban, and non-white Americans to vote. Earlier today, the Republican leader told reporters that, quote, regardless of what may be happening in some states, there's no rationale for federal intervention. The Republican leader flatly stated that no matter what the states do to undermine our democracy, voter suppression laws, phony audits, partisan takeovers of local election boards, the Senate should not act. My colleagues, if Senators 60 years